Good afternoon, everyone. As you get in and get settled, just give us a couple minutes. We'll just start in a minute. We want to wait for the waiting room to empty out into the webinar. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll get started in just a minute. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the AALS Teaching Method webinar, Accentuate the Positive, Eliminate the Negative, Pandemic Pedagogy Wins. And I had to practice that a lot. We are happy you are here today to join us for our 5 fabulous 5-minute tips on taking what we've learned from teaching through the pandemic and bringing it forward into positive teaching changes in the future. As we said, we have 5 fabulous tips for you. The way we're going to operate today is each of our presenters is going to go in order, as we say, 5 minutes each. And at that point, myself, I'm going to turn it over to my co-host, Professor Marcy Karen from the University of District Columbia School of Law, for moderating the questions. And we welcome all of your questions and the discussion about the tips after the presentations are concluded. I'm Deborah Moss-Vohleiler. I'm the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at Nova Southeastern University School of Law. And our first presenter is Dolores Mayer. She is a legal writing specialist from Wayne State University Law School, and she's going to be talking about using the discussion board as a platform for generating kindness and compassion. Professor Mayer, take it away.
Hey, everyone. I'd like to start my talk with a quote from Paulo Coelho, who said in part that the simple things are also the most extraordinary things. And I start with this quote because I made a few very simple changes to my classes that I think turned out to be, if not extraordinary, at least very good. But before I talk about one of those simple changes, I have another quote, this one from Professor Kathy Davidson, who also really eloquently put it that any pandemic era teaching must begin from the premise that our students are learning from a place of dislocation, anxiety, and trauma. And that if that trauma is ignored, if we somehow don't address it or account for it and build it into the course design, we fail our students. So when the abrupt shift to online teaching occurred and we all went into isolation, I knew that it was not going to be okay to just try to replicate what and how I taught before. I knew right away, even before I had read Professor Davidson's insightful article, that I could not ignore that my students, like me, like I, were in a place of dislocation, anxiety, and trauma. So I took a few simple steps to acknowledge the COVID elephant in the Zoom room in my course design. And for this talk, I'll focus on the simple change I made to how I use discussion boards. So pre-pandemic, I used discussion boards for class-related matters, typically providing a prompt dealing with whatever we were working on at that time. And I continued to use discussion boards for that purpose. I'm a big fan of discussion boards, in fact. But the simple change I made was adding what I thought of in my own mind as compassion and caring prompts. I didn't call it that for my students, but that's what I thought of it as. And my hope was that adding these prompts would provide a space for my students to share with each other how they were grappling with the fear and uncertainty of the pandemic, how it was impacting their lives and their studies. And it was also meant to be a space to share any joys and triumphs. And all of that was certainly something that might have happened if they were getting to know each other in person, but far less likely to happen in our isolated Zoom world, no matter how much I made liberal use of breakout rooms. So for example, the first time I did this, I shared with my students that I was feeling particularly joyful because my mom, who was very sick at the time and actually passed away just last week, that at that time she was feeling well and was up and out of bed and eating, and how happy that made me. And I asked my students to share anything that brought them joy that week. And the responses and the discussion that ensued were really pretty remarkable. You know, one student shared that his baby had just been released from the neonatal intensive care unit. Other students shared simple things about how nice it was to have a Starbucks and take a walk. And I could easily spend a whole lot more time discussing how just that one interaction generated so much positive interaction between the students. So after that, I started adding other kindness and compassion prompts. And often it started with me sharing something that happened to me, like my neighbors were sick with COVID and I was baking them lots of cookies and bringing it to their doorstep and hoping they would get well soon. And then students started sharing their stories, how they were protecting themselves or their children, or what they were doing to cope. Other times I simply put up quotes that I found inspirational and let the students take it from there without further prompting from me. So I know I'm running out of time and I'm rushing through this, but to wrap up, my goal was to carve out a space where students could be heard and engage in a dialogue with me and others outside of the strict parameters of class, where they could build a community. And it was a very, very simple thing to do, embarrassingly simple. Maybe many of you have already done it, but I think it reaped many benefits for my class. And now that we are in person, the stress and trauma of COVID, we know, is still with us. And I'm going to continue providing space in my classes for kindness and compassion. After all, we are humans first. And that's the end of my talk. Was I 5 minutes?
That was terrific. Thank you.
Okay,
thank you,
great.
Professor Mayer. Our next 5-minute fabulous tip is from Natalie Rodriguez. She is the Assistant Dean of Academic Success and Associate Professor of Law at Southwestern Law School. And she's going to be talking about how to use Google Docs to administer an individual and group exercise.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. So I know Google Docs is probably not a very new tool for most of you, but what I wanted to spend some time talking about today is, why did I start using Google Docs during the pandemic? I used to use them for personal use, but never really integrated it into the classroom until we were teaching remotely. So first, I'm a fan of collaborative work in the classroom. For me, one of the priorities, along with the skills and substance I'm teaching for my students, is to build a sense of community in the classroom. And one way that I do this is through the integration of collaborative work. However, over the years, I have found that when you don't give students a deliverable of some kind or a concrete task for them to complete and have to turn in, often that group work can become frustrating for students because either they're easily distracted, get off topic, et cetera, et cetera. So the challenge during the pandemic was, one, how can I continue to have these collaborative opportunities in the classroom while we're all on Zoom, which breakout groups worked fine for that, but how can I maintain that deliverable? And that's where Google Docs really came in for me. I will show you just one exercise that I've modified. I chose Google Docs for today's presentation specifically for this exercise because I understand that not all law schools have a sophisticated LMS where you can integrate discussion boards and quizzes and upload assignments. And with Google Docs, it's an open source free account. So really anyone can use this tool in their classroom. And it's a tool that was worth the investment in learning how to use it and integrate other things, because I can continue to use this even when we're back in person in the physical breakout groups that we use in the classroom. One tip I will share that, really I learned just over the last year and a half is that you need to find a way to get every student to engage with the document. And one way I've done that is just by simply asking the students to each enter their own name on the document. I have found by forcing them to do that one thing, they're more likely to then enter other information and work really as a group versus just one person taking the lead. Okay, so with this document, you'll see that there's multiple steps, and I did this intentionally to give you just an idea of how you can use Google Docs. It's a word processor that allows for collaboration, but you can use it both as a handout where you're simply just sharing information with your students on the spot. You can drop the link in the chat so they instantly get that information without having to, when you're online, you can't give them those physical copies unless they have some way to, email it, download it, et cetera, et cetera. This is an easy way to get them that information. But you can also use it collaboratively where they're inputting information. So I've integrated both of those things into this document. And so what I'm going to do now is model for you what I'm doing. So if we were in the classroom and I wanted you to have access to this document, I would copy the link. I'd come back to my chat. And now on your end, you should be able to open this document. I will leave it up so that you don't have to open it. You can just see what we're doing with the document. So the first task is that I'm asking the students to watch a video. They could do this on their own as part of the group. And then I ask them to take a quiz. So this is the first tip that I will give you for how you can integrate other Google tools into Google Doc to make it a more engaging exercise. If you were to click on the link here, it takes you to a Google form that functions just like a quiz would if you were on Canvas, on Twin, or any other LMS or quiz type software. Once the students complete that quiz, you can customize the message they receive. So if you were to complete the quiz, you're going to see that the first thing on that message is the correct answers to the questions. And then it also populates a link to a second document, which is really a duplicate of this document. On this first document, I've set the settings so that you cannot make any changes. It's just a viewable document. But once you get through the quiz, it gives you a link to this second document that now has slightly more information. It gives them information for what to do in their group. And I've linked in additional documents that they will complete and edit as a group. So to give you an example, if you were in group one, once I put everybody into breakout groups, here is your document that's specific to your group and your group alone. There's my box to ensure that students are entering their names and beginning to engage with the document. And it has all the instructions they need to be able to complete the exercise. So I think I'm right out of time. That 5 minutes goes by very fast. But what I've also done is, in case Google Docs are new to you, I will drop in the chat a PDF that walks you through how to start with Google Docs. It is a very basic how to create and share. It talks about how to use the settings for creating a document that is information only. You can't edit the document like the first page you saw. And it also goes through how can you share the document with anyone, even if they don't have a Google form.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Rodriguez. And we look forward, and thank you for sharing those resources. Our next presenter is Michelle Zacharin, Associate Professor of Legal Process from Thoreau College, Jacob D. Fuchsberg Law Center. She is going to be talking about online live critiquing.
Hi, thank you so much. Hello, everybody. Yeah, I wanted to start by just saying, there are many times I've heard people speak of live grading or live critiquing way before the pandemic. I jumped in on that earlier before the pandemic and I loved it. I use it mostly for critiquing, not necessarily giving a full grade, but I have colleagues who give grades and they say it works just as well. It's just your preference. So what it is when a student has something that needs to be graded or critiqued, to do that in person instead of taking the time at home and looking over it and giving the feedback. Every once in a while, one of my assignments, I do it live where they can see me in action, see my reaction to what they wrote and see right away my corrections, edits, suggestions. When we went onto Zoom, I was a little concerned. How am I going to keep this up? It was always in person. They would bring a certain number of pages with them. I kept the rules the same, but I did it as a Zoom meeting. And so it was just me and one student at a Zoom meeting for a certain allotment of time. I chose 30 minutes. It certainly could be 20 minutes, even shorter, however long you think you will need for a particular assignment. I have a rule set for how many pages that student is allowed to bring to the meeting. So I limit it at 3 pages double spaced, but certainly whatever works for you. And of course, what it is about, right? They can't just bring anything. It's about a certain topic. And those rules are all pretty strict. And, that's what we're going to go through. So I wanted to share, to accentuate the positive, I wanted to share some of the positive things that really came out of Zoom and why I actually prefer doing this on Zoom. I prefer it for many reasons. So first of all, having a Zoom with one-on-one with another student, I can allow the student to share his or her screen. I also could share my screen. That's fine. But what I love about, okay, thank you. What I love about sharing the student sharing a screen is that I can see the student's edits and checks, see if the student understands my feedback, see if the student understands some of the things I'm saying, because I can physically see the student typing things in and making corrections. And I love that. Instead of them just watching me and then taking the paper home and not really remembering what it was about. Okay, so that I like even better. I get to watch them make some corrections and if they're doing it wrong, I can correct what they're doing, right? We can have a conversation about it. So I love that aspect. Secondly, I really love the fact that I can record it. I don't record for everyone. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't, but I always ask the student if they'd like a recording of it. Many say yes. I don't know if they ever watch it, but I can record it, send them the link, and then anything that they forgot or weren't sure, they can go ahead and rewatch it and listen and fast forward and do whatever they want. And they have that feedback there again. The other thing that I also love, accentuating the positive, this is very positive, the waiting room. Why do I love the waiting room? Because before, when it was live in person, I always worried about confidentiality and any kind of privacy issues, because I would have students who would come a few minutes early and stand outside my door. And so sometimes my door is closed, but sometimes I'm not comfortable with my door closed. I prefer the door open, or the student prefers the door open. And there was no way to ensure that our private conversation was not being overheard by other students. So the waiting room is perfect. They're told ahead of time, I'm going to get to you as soon as I can get to you, but just hang out and wait until I'm ready for you. And so it really works out great with that as well. So the positive aspects are you can use it for grading or critiquing, but it's just such a great way to schedule your meetings and have them right after another, one after another on Zoom. No one has to commute, travel, or anything. And I just think this was a funny stumble upon, that I found out that it was such a positive way to provide feedback and meet with the students for this type of critiquing. So thank you very much. I think I'm right on time, but thank you very much.
I think we might be setting a record of people sticking to their times of law professors. I'm not sure, but I'm very impressed. Our next speaker is going to be Mary Ann Robinson. She's a professor of law at Villanova University, Charles Widger School of Law, and she's going to be talking to us about bye-bye PowerPoint. Let's just talk.
Hi, everybody. What I'm going to talk about in context, I teach a transactional writing course, and I focus on a range of skills in this course and counseling. The tip I'm going to describe arises from an assignment I give that hopefully combines those two skills, client advising and drafting. So the first graded drafting assignment I ask students to do is to draft sections of an employee manual. So they work in teams of 4 students, and each team drafts a couple of policies that will be included in a corporate client's employee manual. Now, for the advising part, in pre-pandemic days, the students then presented what they drafted to the class, and the class was supposed to be acting as the client, right? The client's receiving the information from their lawyers. And the presentations typically wound up looking like a standard kind of academic, stand and deliver presentation. The teams usually created a PowerPoint or a Prezi, and they used that to walk through the policies that they had drafted. And they usually did a pretty good job of explaining the policies. And then there was time at the end for questions from the client, the members of the class. And this all worked pretty well, but the presentations were a little more formal and academic in nature than I might have liked. And also the class portraying the clients wasn't terribly engaged. They were polite and they would ask questions, but they just weren't super engaged. And it was difficult for me to figure out how to change that dynamic in a classroom setting. And I sort of thought, well, this is good enough. It's a good enough exercise for my learning goals, which were to practice drafting skills and then to practice oral presentation and client communication skills. And then when we had to go remote, I had the opportunity, or perhaps I should say I was forced to rethink this, right? And so here's what I did. I had the team of lawyers make the presentation on Zoom to me and to one other team of 4 students. We were the clients. And I also asked the students portraying the lawyers to send their policies that they drafted to me and the other clients before the presentation. And I told them that this would be the only visual aid. In other words, not to create a PowerPoint or a Prezi, but to rely instead on the text of the policies that they drafted. Now, you may be wondering why I chose to use this smaller group of clients when we were on Zoom. And it was really because when I first did this, it was right when we went on remote. And we were all pretty new to Zoom, and I didn't want the students to be overwhelmed with so many open Zoom windows. But I still wanted the presentation to be more than just me. I particularly wanted it to include people who were less familiar with the substance than I was, because part of what I was assessing was whether they were explaining it well to someone who didn't already know about it. That's why I used these groups of I just picked one other team and me to be the clients. So we had a team of 4 lawyers presenting to a group of 5 clients, right? Now, the change in this setting was remarkable. In front of this smaller group and untethered from the PowerPoints, the presentation had a much more appropriate tone. The students acting as the lawyers got more into their roles as counselors and advisors. Their tone was less academic. It was more conversational. They explained things to the clients about the policies rather than just dumping information on them. And this all met my learning objectives better. The surprising bonus was that the students portraying the clients were more engaged. They asked better questions, probably because it was a smaller group, so they were felt more accountable, right? And they paid better attention. And they also gave more useful feedback at the end. And then there was another bonus number 2, if you will, and that's that I had heard from practitioners even before the pandemic that fewer client meetings were happening in person. More meetings were happening either through some sort of virtual platform or even on the phone. So I think this new format for this assignment provides the students with a more realistic experience. The assignment now takes the students out of the academic presentation mode and gives them the opportunity to practice the skill of talking to a client in a way that they will more frequently have to do in practice. So now that I'm back otherwise teaching fully in person, I'm keeping these presentations as remote class sessions on Zoom, and I'm continuing to run them this way because I think it's a big improvement over the way I did it before. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And for our last presentation, we're going to have Ron Hochbaum, Assistant Clinical Professor of Law at the University of the Pacific, McGeorge School of Law, to talk about a basic needs policy in a syllabus.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the teaching methods section for inviting me to speak today. For my 5-minute tip, I'll be talking to you about basic needs policies and syllabi. But before I do, I'm going to begin with a brief anecdote about my personal connection to this. So growing up, my brother and I had a set of grandparents that were not our biological grandparents nor our step-grandparents. Rather, this family informally adopted and cared for my uncle after he emigrated to the US and enrolled in Berkshire Community College. Being an international student, my uncle wasn't permitted to work. He didn't have money for food, and he frequently would go to the cafeteria to take free honey packets to satiate his hunger. And one day, the head of the cafeteria approached him, but instead of reporting him to the school, he asked him what he was doing and why he was doing it. And when my uncle explained his situation, my unofficial grandfather, Max, gave him a job under the table. They grew close, and soon my uncle was at their dinner table on a weekly basis. And without Max, I think that my uncle likely would not have obtained a bachelor's degree. While food insecurity and basic needs, or the lack of basic needs, is more prevalent in community college and undergraduate settings, I believe that we have more law students struggling to meet basic needs than we fully appreciate. While we can't employ all of them, I do think there's a simple step we can take, and that's adopting these basic needs policies. The basic needs policy was first popularized by Sarah Goldrick-Rab of Temple University in a 2017 blog post. I pasted a template policy from Professor Goldrick-Rab in the chat earlier. And as you can see, she makes a connection between the lack of basic needs and student performance, inviting students to seek out resources and approach her about their situation if they're comfortable. While this policy addresses food and housing instability, I think it's important to keep in mind that professors are beginning to recognize and include a number of other basic needs in their policies, including clothing, health, mental health, childcare, and transportation. While I contemplated adopting a basic needs policy before the pandemic, COVID-19 really made it a no-brainer. In March 2020, as we transitioned our classes to remote offerings, at minimum, your school scrambled to make sure students had the basic necessary technology to participate, but they also likely considered how to accommodate students who got sick or needed to care for ill family members, students who were being forced into homelessness because of dorm closures, and hungry students who could no longer use their meal plans. Despite the pandemic's acute need for basic needs policies, I really believe that these policies were essential and beneficial before the pandemic and will remain so as we begin or continue to transition to our former instructional models. All you have to do is really consider the benefits. First and foremost, it's about setting students up for success. Students who can't meet their basic needs may perform poorly in your classes and may even end up dropping out of law school altogether. The impact of hunger and dehydration on brain function is well studied. It includes fatigue, dizziness, impaired concentration, and reduced cognitive ability. Housing instability at minimum can deprive students of quiet places to study and decrease the quality of their sleep, which impacts their abilities to concentrate, create new memories, problem solve, and exercise judgment. While I'm not aware of studies that show the rates of food and housing instability in law school environments, a recent University of California system study found that 26% of graduate students experienced food insecurity and 19% experienced housing insecurity after enrolling in their graduate programs. And these rates were even higher among Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students. Another benefit of the policy is I think it simply raises awareness among students and in the law school community more generally. In the process, it destigmatizes poverty in the law school environment. Low-income students may already feel like outsiders in law school, but the basic needs policy works to normalize their experience. It also sets the tone for students that are impacted and not in your class. By including the policy, you're demonstrating that you care about all of your students and their academic success. This is likely to make you more approachable, which in and of itself will improve student performance. And finally, it just makes your job as an educator easier. It's easier to teach students who are receiving these basic supports because they're more able to devote their attention to their studies. Basic needs policies are being adopted widely. Professors at over 200 institutions have confirmed adoption of these policies. And with the pandemic shining a spotlight on the impacts of inequality and on health and learning, their popularity will only continue to grow. But at a more basic level, our success as educators and law schools is wrapped up in our student success. And knowing that basic needs are necessary to learn, grow, and thrive, these policies should be part of our approach moving forward. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all our presenters for their 5 incredibly interesting tips. And at this point, I'll turn it over to our co-moderator for questions.
Great. So first, everyone take a collective breath. That was a lot of information at once. We ping-ponged between empathy and group work to get everyone to participate at least once, to working one-on-one with live feedback, to basic needs, which ties us back to empathy pretty nicely. And clearly that wasn't enough time for any of the tips, although kudos to all of you for actually fighting the hypo and staying at least very close to the timeline, because that leaves us plenty of time for conversation and questions. We have asked all of the speakers to write up their tip as well. So for those of you that want to share something you've learned or make sure you've caught some of the resources that have been shared, just know that they, along with some others who had submitted tips as part of our call for speakers, we have captured and will capture all of them in our section newsletter. But because we do have this time, I ask that you put your name in the chat so I can see who has a question, who wants to be in the queue. If for any reason you don't want to ask your question publicly, but you'd like it asked, I'm happy to ask it for you. Just go ahead and send a private message to me instead of sending it to everyone. And with that, again, I appreciate that all of our speakers pinpointed some positivity during this pandemic with respect to their pedagogy. I also appreciate that we got to practice what we preach often in terms of being flexible and adaptable with some phone calls and some tech hiccups that, you know, that's what happens in our classrooms as well. And so it doesn't look like I gave enough time for folks to really get started and put them their questions in there. So that means I get to ask a question, which is very exciting. And so actually, I want to open it up to any of the speakers, because these tips do flow nicely between each other and across the curriculum in terms of clinics, writing, whether it's transactional or other writing courses, non-clinical courses that are focused more on exclusively on doctrine. And so do any of you have questions for each other? Or did you, is there a connection between another tip that you want to call out and amplify?
I actually have a question for Ron about the policy, which is just terrific, and I'm going to share it with our Dean of Students. When you say that you asked to notify the professor, then is there a sort of a standard response, or is this an individual response? I mean, in other words, how do you individually know what resources are available for students? How do you connect students with resources?
Yeah. That's a great question, and I think it's a concern. If you look at the dialogue about basic needs policies online, is a concern that professors have. I'll just point out to that end that some professors, because of their personal preferences, don't necessarily invite students to approach them, but will just direct them to student services or to the information that is available either through their university or in their local community. But I think that there's a benefit to actually inviting students to approach you, even if they may not ultimately feel comfortable doing so. Like I was mentioning in the presentation, I think it just creates a culture of caring in your classroom. And certainly promotes student success, right? But that being said, part of I think professors' anxieties is not knowing what the available resources are, and so I definitely did some work early on to make sure that I was aware. I spoke with my deans of student services. I looked at my institution's websites to see what was available. I think because I teach in the clinical law setting, I'm also just generally more aware of resources that are available to people who are living in poverty. But I would encourage you to do that work within your own communities and institutions, because it'll allow you to identify gaps and then maybe raise those concerns with your faculties, with your deans, so those gaps can be filled in the near future.
We had a question come in for Professor Meyer, and that's whether or not you have any concern about with some of the kindness threads, whether they could potentially go too private or force people to disclose information that they don't want to disclose because they want to appease you, or they want you to, get you to act to help them out. So whether you have any concerns there. And I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself. We had to do it at least once during the webinar.
Yeah, I mean, that was certainly a concern of mine when I first started thinking about this, the line between me as the professor and the student. And then, but that's why I like discussion boards, is that they don't have to respond. It wasn't part of their grade. It was completely optional. And if I had asked, if it's a question like that had been asked in class, say, what brought you joy today? Which is kind of a neutral question. It could be answered any which way. But if I'd asked that in class, I might have only had a few students respond. Whereas in a discussion board, it just led to a thread going back and forth. And again, it was completely optional. Most students did participate and talk to each other that way. But of course, I did have that concern.
Thanks. I see that we're starting to get some tips shared from our audience in the chat as well. So if any of you have tips that you want to share, please do feel free to put them in there. Before I get to our next question, to get that going for people who weren't designated as speakers, I'm going to share a 1-minute tip as opposed to a 5-minute fabulous tip in hopes that others will start putting theirs in the chat. In my classes, regardless of whether it's a clinic course or a non-clinical course, over the last year and a half, I have started doing 1 or 2 minute brain breaks. And they are just short 1 or 2 minute ways to pivot between topics and give everyone a chance to go off screen to stretch or stand or whatever else it might be. So in my classes, I've done everything from a 2-minute body scan as part of a meditation, not long enough to really, indoctrinate someone into mindfulness that hasn't been doing that already, but at least to give a break. I've also done dance breaks. We've watched live jelly cam fishes, just really a range of things to give folks a chance to take a minute, right, digest, and then move on. Some of my classes are 3 hours, right? And so obviously I also take some longer breaks or do some longer exercises as well, but just that 1 or 2 minute break between topics has really kept students engaged in the second part of classes. So a question has come in for Dean Rodriguez. Do you have any privacy concerns with using Google products? Because I know some universities have some policies that prohibit the use of Google and some other external sites, even if they are free. So have you come across that at all?
I haven't, but I do think you should look into what your own institutional policies would be on using these resources. I know some schools have Google accounts that are provided through the institution. I have not come across any issues whatsoever in the now 1.5 years of using Google Docs with students or just professionally. I'm currently working on a scholarship piece, and that's how the co-author and I are editing our document along with our research assistants and a third co-author, and it's worked out just fine. But it is something you should be aware of and look into and comply with your institution's policy. One, not related to privacy, but another concern I've heard is that sometimes the Google products are not easy to read for students who have any kind of visual impairment. I've not experienced that personally. I came across that information. So that's another thing to consider. If any of your students have that sort of need, that you have an alternative way to get the information to them so that you're not hindering their learning by using a tool such as this.
Thanks. Thanks for sharing that, and always a good reminder to be aware of the systems in which you are operating, whether you're virtually or in person. It's something that I think as people have gone back, or as some of us are still remote, as we start to think about going back, a reminder of making sure that what you're doing fits for whatever structure you're a part of, And that actually leads to a question for Michelle about whether or not you plan on still doing the online live critiquing, in person, or if how you might adapt that, thinking about how everyone could consider integrating this into their practice moving forward.
Yeah, I plan to continue online critiquing, to be honest. So if I have a student though who prefers in person, I have no problem with that. And I'll certainly meet with students who prefer in person and who are there. That would never be a problem for me. But I think I'm going to, my plan for this semester, I haven't gotten there yet, but that's the plan on my syllabus, is that it'll be online this year as a default. And of course, I'll take recommendations. There's, from students if they need in person, but it worked out so much better that I prefer it, and I didn't hear anything from any negative feedback from students about it. So I recommend giving it a try. Either way, if you've never done live grading or live critiquing, but I recommend the online is just a nice option and very informal and just a nice, relaxing place to be. So.
Professor Robinson, now that you have gone back to talking and said goodbye or bye-bye to PowerPoints, do any students ask you for them? Because I've seen the trend with some people going the opposite direction with the virtual learning. They're using the PowerPoints more as a crutch than perhaps they might have in person. And so I wonder if your students have gotten any pushback or given you any pushback on that.
Sure. So in all fairness, it's the students that I don't let them use the PowerPoint. I'm still totally PowerPoint dependent. But it's in this context of talking to a client that I ask them not to do it, because I don't think you won't ever use a PowerPoint with a client, right? I mean, I never did. And I think so, but they're so used to, if they stand in front of a classroom, they think they need a PowerPoint, that they defaulted to that. So I have I have had one team ask me if they could do a PowerPoint and share their screen. And I actually said no to them. I said, I want you to rely on the text of what you drafted, because that's what the client's going to have in front of them. So if you need something more than that, then maybe there's something wrong with what you drafted, or maybe you need a short summary sheet of the policy, but it's not a PowerPoint, right? That's not the way we communicate with clients. So that's and they I haven't gotten any pushback, as I said, other than this one team that asked me, and even when I said no, I didn't get any pushback. I've never gotten any pushback from anybody else or even any other requests to do it. So it's worked pretty well.
Great. I'm smiling in part because I direct a clinic and my students used a PowerPoint yesterday in a coalition meeting, but I understand, and that's an abnormality for the practice, but I hear you. And it's also, you have to know your own audience and your own community. And so these are tips for us to consider. It doesn't mean we all incorporate all of them every class. It just means that we have more tools in our toolkit. And so Professor Hochbaum, a question came in for you about whether you flagged for university administration that you're including a basic needs policy in your syllabus.
Yeah, so I haven't done that yet. I took the approach of that I'd rather ask for forgiveness later if it becomes an issue, although I'm rather confident that I would have the support of my institution in doing this. I think the institution at large is considering lots of different ways of how to make the law school environment more inviting for students that are underrepresented in our classes. And so I really think that I won't run into any issues, and I haven't heard any or read anything among the 200 institutions where they have been adopted of those issues. In fact, you can go on a number of institutions' websites, including UC, University of Hawaii, University of Wyoming. They all have pages dedicated to this. They're encouraging their faculty to adopt them. And so, yeah, my law school, my institution hasn't dictated to me concretely what can or cannot be in my syllabi, and I haven't run into any issues. I've shared it with my colleagues, and they've all been supportive.
Did any of your colleagues ask you about or talk to you about whether they should incorporate it into their syllabi? So it would be sort of more universal amongst your colleagues, even if it wasn't yet at the institutional level?
Yeah, so I would say I'm beginning to discuss this. Actually, today is, I'm thinking about starting to talk about this more broadly. I think my colleagues have expressed interest. The McGeorge faculty, I may end up speaking to the McGeorge faculty more broadly about these policies and the reactions that I'm getting from students. So I think there's interest from my colleagues. I'm not aware of any that have adopted them yet, although I'm brand new at Pacific McGeorge. I just started this fall semester, and so I think they're getting to know me. I'm getting to know them, and we're all starting to trade teaching tips just like we are today.
Professor or Dean Rodriguez, a question came in for you. When you were talking about using the Google Doc form to get students engaged, even typing their name could be something that got them started to do more. Do you see the use of more structured forms improving participation to the extent that it decreased the ever-present complaint of group slackers for group work when you would do breakout sessions or otherwise? Do you see that structured form, the quiz that you had the link to or otherwise? As helping kind of keep everyone engaged, even if beyond just writing their name?
Sure, and the tip was actually to have them enter their name on the Google Doc, not necessarily the form, although there, if you don't have a field for name, you won't be able to tie it to an individual. So very important to include a name field. But yes, to the second part of your question, which is, have I seen improvement with more structured exercises? Absolutely. If it's too open-ended, I do think students just get lost in a conversation or are unclear about what was the expectation for their output for the exercise you gave them. So if you complete the form, you'll get access to that third document that they would have completed in a group work session. And you'll see it's very specific. Like in that one, I even have a table where I'm asking them to specifically fill in information into the column. And I have found that the work they produce is better the more specific I am about what I'm asking for. So you have to think about that as you're choosing your exercises. Is this an exercise that's appropriate for group work that's going to require a lot of instruction and detail? Or would I rather it be more open-ended and therefore more of an individual exercise that can still be completed during class time?
I am popcorning between speakers as the questions come in, so please keep sending them my way. And Professor Robinson, back to you. The next question for you is whether the requirement of students not using PowerPoints has improved their presentation skills to date. Like, do you see a measurable difference when they're not relying on the screen or the text that's on the screen?
I really do. I think we've all had that experience where a presenter will read their PowerPoint slides to you. And there's nothing more boring in the world, is there? Because you're like, what am I doing here? I could read this to myself. So they just wind up being more conversational. Now, that's not to say that they aren't to a certain extent scripted, and you certainly can hear that on occasion they're kind of reading from a script, but it just has freed them in a way to talk and not present, if you understand the distinction that I'm making. I'm almost to the point where I'm willing to think about making this more of a conversation between the clients and the presenters, and the lawyers. I'm just a little afraid that with the students' lack of experience in controlling that and reining questions in, that they might not get a chance to finish everything they have to say. So I haven't quite figured out how to do that, but I'm headed there, and I'm headed there because I think that's the more realistic thing that would happen in practice. And just to say one more thing about the prohibiting the PowerPoint, the other thing I'm trying to get them ready for is if they have to do this in a phone call, right? So if they have to do this in a phone call, which I also hear from practitioners happens a lot, they don't even have that share screen ability. So I really want them to be able to talk through the policy without having to rely on something like a PowerPoint. And I'm really finding that they're able to do it.
That's a excellent add-on point. And I will share that there were at least 2 people that were participating in the coalition meeting yesterday who couldn't see the screens. And so the flexibility for being able to do it in different modes of communication, I think, is really important. So thanks for adding that. The next question is for Professor Zakarin. It is whether or not you think the techniques and benefits of the live online critique that you're doing with your students is limited to the type of feedback you're doing on those documents, or whether it could be used more broadly.
So if I understand the question, I guess I should just start by saying, I don't know that you can do this for every assignment. I do think there is a real need for specific, detailed written feedback, especially in a class like I teach legal writing. It's part of the job. It's just what it is, and it's what they need. But there's an assignment that I specifically use for this live critiquing, and it's they have an open universe memorandum due, at some point first semester. So their rough draft before that is due. Their rough draft, they do get a grade on that. They do ultimately get, some feedback on that. But I will look before they hand that rough draft in. I will look at a certain section of it, like a section that's really maybe a little bit more complicated, a little bit complex with the legal analysis. And I'll have them write up, a few pages of legal analysis that I limit it to something that I think is really a little more difficult, where they can use more of a conversation and some feedback, but in the form of a conversation where we can go back and forth and they can follow up and ask me why, what's going on. And I think it works great, because by that point, they've received a lot of written feedback from me on some smaller assignments. This is a pretty big one. This is going to count a little bit more toward their grade, and they get a little extra feedback. And I often tell them, this is the only time I really can look at something that you will be handing in before you hand it in, because I don't allow them to, keep handing in before their grade. So this is the only time, and I just think it works great. I don't know how it would work with every assignment I do. Like I said before, I think it's limited to certain times, but I think it works great. I hope that answered the question. I may have misunderstood. I hope I answered the question. Please follow up if I did not get it right.
So please follow up with me so I can do the conduit if that didn't get to it. But I was following, and I appreciate that, as well as the thinking critically about what do you do for one assignment is not the same as the next. What you do for perhaps even one group of students isn't going to be the same as the next group of students as well. And so definitely lots of lessons learned that can be drawn from that.
Yeah, that's correct. And I'll just add that, right, no 2 live critiques are the same ever. It's just the conversations are different. Sometimes they last a little longer. Sometimes they're a little shorter. It's just the nature of what's written combined with the personality types, who are there. It's just, it always, it changes each time. So.
Absolutely. So we are going to ask all of the presenters if there's one last elevator pitch for their tip they want to make, any last statements. In a round robin version, I'm going to go in the order that you presented your tips. It's okay to pass if you were so succinct in your 5 minutes in the follow-up Q&A. We just wanted to make sure everyone had an opportunity to give a last pitch for their tip. So Professor Meyer, anything you want to add as your last pitch for your tip?
Well, I did have good response from students that they appreciated the chance to get to know each other better than they would have otherwise, especially given the isolation they were all under. And again, it might not work for every class, it might not work for every professor, but it did work for me, and I'm glad I gave it a try. I should add, I didn't do this in every single discussion board. It wasn't like every week, but every here and there, we would just have these conversations or give them the space to have conversations with each other. And so that's my elevator pitch.
And yes, I did elevator pitches in my clinic yesterday, so it is on my mind.
Yeah, I'm not sure what an elevator pitch is, but I think that was it, right?
Yeah, you got it.
Okay, all right.
That's the next webinar. Dean Rodriguez.
I think I would really highlight the flexibility of Google Docs, and that it's not meant to replace an LMS, it can actually be integrated beautifully if you already have an LMS, and you can link to quizzes on your Canvas page or your Twin page. So it's a nice alternative that can be used both while being remote or in person.
Perfect. That was a DC-sized elevator. I like it. Professor Zachary.
Sure. I'll just add that in my class, I have office hours all the time, and not everyone shows up. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But this live critiquing, everyone's forced to meet with me. It's the one time in the semester every single student must meet with me. And this is one of the things I love about it, is that I have to sit and have a conversation with this student. And so I just, I guess I really urge that, everyone just try it, or, give it a try if it's something you think could be useful in your course.
Professor Robinson.
Actually, I think you made my pitch for me when you said how important it is that we all, and especially students, learn how to communicate in different formats. And I think we just have to keep in mind, particularly what they're going to have to do in practice, and have an eye forward to that, to give them the skills they need for that.
Ronnie.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add that I know at this juncture, we don't know the scope of the problem with respect to our clients' access to basic needs. But what I do know is that we as legal academicians are undergoing a reckoning with respect to anti-racist education in our halls. And I really think that basic needs policies are about responding to these demands from our students and responding to their needs. This will allow us to listen to them and respond accordingly. And so I would encourage you to reach out to me offline to check out Sarah Goldrick-Rab's post and join the community that's integrating these into their syllabi.
Well, thank you, everyone. Our last pandemic positive tip is to end on time. And if you can end 15 seconds early, everyone appreciates that. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you very much to the people who submitted tips and the 5 presenters today. I look forward to trying out some of them in my own pedagogy and hope others do as well. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.